The late autumn wind cut through the prairie like a knife, lifting dust into the air and chilling the bones of anyone caught outside too long. Most townsfolk of Clearwater had already shuttered their windows, drawn their fires close, and locked their doors tight before sundown. But that didn't stop the figure stumbling down the main street, his arms cradling a bundled infant, his boots worn to holes, and his face gaunt with fatigue. He was Lakota, and that was all anyone needed to know. Vicasa kept his eyes low as he walked past the general store, the church, and the saloon. He didn't belong here, he knew that, but he had no choice. His baby, no more than 6 weeks old, was sick with cold. Her cough had deepened, and she hadn't taken more than a sip of milk since dawn. Her skin was warm with fever. If he didn't find help tonight, she wouldn't survive the morning. He stopped in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney and knocked out no answer. He knocked again, a little harder, calling out in broken English. "Please, baby is sick. Cold? Milk?" The door creaked open just an inch. A white woman peeked through, her face pinched with suspicion and fear. The moment her eyes met Vicasa's brown skin, braids tied with leather, a child swaddled in old hide, her face twisted in alarm. "Get away from here," she barked. "We don't take in your kind. Not now. Not ever." The door slammed shut. Vicasa didn't flinch. He had heard worse. He'd seen worse. He only pressed the baby closer to his chest, whispering in Lakota, "Be strong, Luda. Just a little longer." He moved on, knocking again and again on door after door. One man opened and simply spat at his feet. Another cursed and waved the rifle. Even the preacher's home, where the cross hung proudly above the entry, offered no grace. A servant stepped outside to shoo him away with a broom handle, barking, "This is a house of God, not charity for savages." Luda began to wail, her cry thin and desperate. He dropped to his knees in the alley behind the mercantile, shielding her from the wind with his body. Tears filled his eyes, but he did not let them fall. Lakota men didn't cry, not even when their wives died giving birth, not even when they wandered foreign lands where their children were despised before they could speak. He remembered his wife's last breath. The way she had reached for his hand, whispered, "Our daughter is hope," and smiled as her life slipped away. He had carried that memory and their daughter for weeks now through forest, river, and dust. And now here, to a place where even the dogs growled at him. Still, he rose again. There had to be someone with a heart big enough to see past the color of his skin. Someone who would understand that a baby couldn't be blamed for the blood in her veins, and then he saw it. A small cabin on the edge of town, half hidden behind a thicket of bare cottonwood trees. No lights in the windows, but a curl of smoke rose steadily from the chimney. It was far enough from the others that perhaps its occupant didn't follow their ways. He hesitated. His legs were numb. His pride, long buried under grief, didn't want to face another door slamming in his face. But Luda coughed, again sharp and ragged. He had no more time. Vicasa stepped onto the creaking porch and knocked, this time softer. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply waited. The door didn't fly open this time. Instead, it opened slowly, cautiously. And in its frame stood a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, auburn hair pulled back in a rough braid, eyes sharp but not unkind. She held a rifle at her side, angled down but ready. She said nothing for a long moment, just stared. And he stared back, too tired to speak, too full of sorrow to explain. Then the baby cried again, barely a whisper of a sound. The woman lowered the rifle. Her voice was quiet. You need help?" Vicasa nodded. She looked past him, down the road into the dark town, then back at his cracked lips, the frost clinging to the baby's cloth. Her expression softened just a little. "Well," she sighed, "you'd best come in. I ain't the sort to let a baby die on my doorstep." Picasso's knees almost buckled with relief. He stepped into the warmth, holding Luda tightly, and though he didn't know the woman's name yet, he knew he'd found something rare, a sliver of mercy in a world that had turned its back. The warmth inside. Sarah Blake's cottage was modest, but enough to sting Picasso's frozen fingers. He hesitated just past the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the flickering light of the small fire burning in the hearth. The room smelled faintly of old bread, tobacco, and lavender, soft and unfamiliar scents. The woman motioned for him to shut the door. "Sit there." She pointed to a wooden stool near the fire. Picasso obeyed without question, gently lowering himself down. He cradled the baby closer, pulling her tiny hands into the folds of her wrap. The woman moved briskly through the kitchen, pulling a kettle off the stove and pouring warm water into a bowl. "You're lucky I was still awake," she muttered. "I don't take visitors after sundown." He didn't respond. The truth was, he barely understood her words. English was something he'd picked up in fragments, most of it shouted by soldiers, barked by traders, or muttered by missionaries. With wary eyes, but her tone was not cruel. Suspicious, yes. Guarded, but not cruel. She brought over the bowl and set it on a side table. Then she knelt down in front of him, studying the infant. Her face changed. "Oh, Lord," she breathed. "She's burning up." Picasso's eyes followed her hands as she pressed the inside of her wrist against the baby's forehead, then unwrapped part of the blanket to check her color, her brow furrowed in worry. "How long's she been like this? Cold?" "Picasso said softly, "Many day, no milk, no fire." The woman sucked in a breath and stood. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a tin of goat's milk, a ragged cloth, and a chipped spoon. Carefully, she warmed the milk near the fire and spoon-fed a few drops into the baby's mouth. The child fussed, coughed, and swallowed. Weakly, but she drank. Wicasa watched, overwhelmed. Sarah didn't look at him as she worked. Her hands were steady, but her face held that careful, closed expression like someone trying not to feel too much. When she finally settled the baby into a basket lined with an old quilt, she straightened up and crossed her arms. Her eyes locked on him. "I'm Sarah Blake," she said, her voice clear. "This is my home, my land. That baby's sick, and I won't let her die. But I need to know what happened." "You can speak some English, can't you?" Picasso nodded. "Little. Try." "Who? Is she your daughter?" "Yes." "Her mother?" He closed his eyes. A deep ache moved through his chest. "Gone. Die." Sarah's arms dropped to her sides. For a moment, a flicker of pain crossed her face. "I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. "Lost someone too," she said finally, her voice softer. "My husband, 3 winters ago, died in the war. He was all I had." Picasso looked up at her, unsure if she was trying to connect or warn him. Her face was pale, eyes hollow with a grief she wore like a second skin. But she hadn't hardened completely. Not yet. She glanced toward the baby, then back at him. "What's her name?" He blinked. Surprised, she asked. "Luda," he said. "It means red." Sarah gave the faintest smile. "Luda, pretty name." She turned, moved to the fireplace, and stirred the embers with a long iron rod. The quiet crackle of firewood was the only sound between them for a time. "You can stay the night," she said at last. "But you'll sleep in the barn." Picasso nodded quickly. He hadn't expected more. She paused at the doorway. "You can come in to feed the baby. That's all. I'm not inviting trouble with the town. Understand?" "Yes," he said. "Thank you." As she walked out into the cold night to open the barn for him, Picasso stood and carefully lifted Luda from her resting place. The warmth of the fire clung to her tiny body. She sighed in her sleep, fingers curling around the edge of his coat. He looked around the room one last time before following Sarah outside. It wasn't his home. It wasn't even shelter for long. But it was the first roof that hadn't come with a rifle pointed at his chest. And for now, that was enough. He stepped into the barn's darkness, breathing in the smell of hay and old wood. As Sarah handed him a lantern and pulled the door shut, behind her, he whispered to the baby, "This woman. She is not like the others." Morning crept in slow and gray, casting a soft glow over the fields beyond Sarah Blake's cabin. Frost had gathered on the barn door overnight, and Vikasa woke stiff. His arms still curled protectively around Luda's sleeping form. The straw beneath him offered little warmth, but he hadn't slept so soundly in weeks. He sat up carefully and checked Luda's face. Her fever had dropped. Her cheeks were still flushed, but the color looked more like life than danger now. Her breathing was soft, even. A rooster crowed in the distance, and Vikasa took that as his cue. Gently wrapping Luda against his chest, he pushed the barn door open and stepped into the morning. Sarah was already outside. She wore a heavy shawl over her shoulders, her auburn hair twisted in a knot, a tin coffee cup steaming in her hands. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, her expression was unreadable. "You sleep?" she asked flatly. "Yes," Vikasa said, still uncertain which words were safest. "And the baby?" He nodded. "Better." She took a sip from her cup, then motioned toward the back of the house. "Bring her in. I've got more milk warmed, but after that, I want answers, real ones." Vikasa followed her without argument. Inside, the fire was already lit, the cabin smelling faintly of oats and ash. He sat on the stool near the hearth as Sarah carefully took Luda into her arms. The way she handled the baby, gentle but efficient, made him think she had once dreamed of having children herself. "She's a strong little thing," Sarah muttered, tilting a spoonful of milk toward Luda's lips. "Must have gotten that from her mother." Vikasa swallowed. Her mother was strong, brave. Sarah paused at the word "was." She glanced at him. "What happened?" He hesitated. His words were slow, but sincere. "My wife, she died after Luda born. We live far from village. No doctor, no help. Just me." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then handed Luda back. "And you've been traveling with her ever since?" "Yes, walk hide, people see. Me, they angry. Say I steal baby. Say I savage. I go far to find safe place. You think this is a safe place?" she asked, her voice dry. He shrugged lightly. "Better than road." She stood and moved toward the table, busying herself with chores, clearing dishes that had barely been touched, wiping her hands on a threadbare towel. The silence between them was not hostile, but heavy with questions. "I'm not running a boarding house," she said finally. "And I don't owe you anything. You understand that?" "I know. I took you in because of the child, not you. If the baby hadn't been burning up, I wouldn't have opened my door. So don't get the wrong idea." Vikasa looked down. "I understand." Sarah stared at him for a few seconds longer, then sighed and sat across from him. "You're not the first Lakota I've seen. During the war, I saw more than a few, both sides of the line. Some fought with honor. Some didn't, same as white men. But I know how towns like this think. And I know what happens when a white woman is seen helping a Lakota man, especially one carrying a baby that might not be hers." Vikasa's jaw tightened. "She is mine." Sarah nodded slowly. "I believe you. But the town won't." He met her gaze and held it. "Then why help me?" She blinked at the question. It was the first time he'd spoken with such directness. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I saw myself in her. Maybe I was tired of being afraid of what the neighbors say, Or maybe I just couldn't watch another life die when I had the means to stop it. Neither spoke for a while after that. Luda squirmed quietly in Vikasa's arms, eyes fluttering open as she reached for his face. Her fingers brushed his cheek. Sarah stood and walked to the door. You can stay until she's well. Vikasa looked up. But after that, she continued, we'll figure out what's next, for both of you. Don't expect more than that. I'm not running a mission. And I sure as hell don't trust you yet. I not ask for trust, he said. Just time. She nodded once and opened the door. Then don't waste it. As she stepped out to feed her chickens, Vikasa remained by the fire with Luda, thinking about the woman who had given them a few borrowed days of warmth and life. He knew she didn't trust him, but what she didn't know was that he didn't trust himself either. Not yet. It didn't take long. By the second morning, the whispers had already started. Sarah first noticed it when she rode into town for supplies. The general store, usually filled with half-hearted chatter and clinking tins, fell strangely quiet the moment she stepped through the door. Mrs. Greeley, the preacher's wife, who always smiled and commented on Sarah's quilting, turned her back without a word. Sarah didn't ask questions. She kept her head high and her list short: flour, oats, milk, and thread. As she placed the items on the counter, Mr. Cullen, an aging, red-faced man who'd run the store since before her marriage, eyed her carefully. You got company out there, Miss Blake? He asked, voice casual but sharp around the edges. Sarah didn't blink. I have a sick baby I'm tending to. He paused. That the same one brought in by that redskin fella? Her jaw tightened. He's Lakota. And that child's his daughter. Kellen huffed, his lip curling slightly. Don't matter whose it is. Word is he was sniffing around behind barns before he came to you. Can't trust a stray like that, especially one carrying a child that ain't pale. Sarah gathered her things slowly, deliberately. He didn't come looking for trouble. He came looking for milk. And I wasn't raised to turn a baby away from my doorstep. Kellen shook his head. You keep siding with strangers, Miss Blake, and don't be surprised if folks stop siding with you? Sarah left without another word. When she got back home, she found Vikasa in the garden patch, kneeling in the earth, weeding between the last of the season's dying cabbage stalks. Luda was asleep in a cradle he'd rigged from a basket and lined with dried grasses. The sight stopped Sarah cold. Vikasa hadn't asked to help. She hadn't told him to do anything. And yet, he worked without complaint, tending to a land not his own, under a sky that barely tolerated him. She walked past him into the house, put the groceries away, and stared at the fire until the anger cooled into something duller. We are RIER. By evening, the knock on the door was louder than usual. It came with boots on the porch, 3 sets. Sarah opened it cautiously to find Mr. Jenkins, the town blacksmith, flanked by 2 men she didn't know well. Their faces were set like stone. Miss Blake, Jenkins said, touching the brim of his hat. We come respectful, but the town's worried. You got a dangerous man living here. Sarah folded her arms. He's not dangerous. He's a father with a sick baby. Then why's he hiding out in your barn? He's not hiding. He's healing. That child was half dead when he arrived. One of the other men scoffed. That's what they do, show up all sad and needy. Then next thing you know, your chickens are gone, your barn's burned, and your livestock's got arrows in their backs. Sarah stepped forward, her voice icy. He hasn't asked for a single thing but water and warmth for his child. Hasn't taken a dime. You want to be afraid of something. Be afraid of the men who would let a baby die in the cold just to feel superior. Jenkins looked uneasy. No one's saying let the baby die. We just think it'd be best if he moved along. Before folks start getting stirred up. Sarah gave a thin smile. Then I suggest folks find something better to stir. Good evening, gentlemen. She closed the door before they could answer. Later that night, after Luda had been fed and tucked into her little basket by the fire, Vikasa approached Sarah as she stitched a torn sleeve by lamplight. "You angry?" he said softly. She didn't. "Look up. Not at you." He shifted his weight. "I leave. If it bring danger, I not want trouble for you." Sarah finally met his eyes. There was a flicker of fear in her chest, real, heavy fear. She'd heard the tone in Jenkins' voice, seen the way his hand rested near the butt of his pistol. But there was something in her that wouldn't bend. "My husband died on a battlefield," she said. "Fighting men who claimed to be his countrymen. And still, I fed his enemies when they came limping through. Not because I agreed with them, but because they were human, same as you, same as Luda." Vikasa said nothing. "You leave if you want," she added. "But I won't send you away. I won't be the woman who let a child go back out into the cold just to make cowards comfortable." He bowed his head deeply in respect. "Thank you." The wind picked up outside, brushing dry leaves against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled. Gently the world beyond might hate them both, but in that little house on the edge of Clearwater, a stranger and a widow had drawn their line, not in anger, but in quiet, unshakable mercy. For the first time in weeks, the child laughed out. It was a small sound at first, barely a breath of joy, but unmistakable. Luda sat on a folded quilt near the fire. Clapping her chubby hands against a wooden spoon, Vikasa had whittled down to a harmless rattle. Her eyes sparkled, cheeks pinked with new health, and her giggle rose again. Bright and full of life. Sarah froze in place, her hands wrapped around the mixing bowl. She turned slowly toward the sound. Luda looked up at her, blinked, and then laughed. Again, louder this time, a silly bubbling sound that filled the cabin like sunshine cracking through heavy clouds. Sarah couldn't help herself. A laugh escaped her, two more of a surprised breath and a full laugh, but enough that Vikasa noticed. He looked up from the broom he was holding and smiled faintly. It was the first time she'd seen joy on his face. "She laugh," he said. "Simply, she does," Sarah replied. "First time since she got here. First time." "In long time," Vikasa added. Sarah crouched beside the child, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. Luda reached toward her, fingers grasping her shawl. Without hesitation, Sarah lifted the child into her arms and kissed her soft forehead. The baby giggled again and buried her face in Sarah's neck. That little girl had no idea what lines she was crossing with that small gesture. How many walls, how many fears. Sarah held her close, breathing her in. And for the first time since she buried her husband 3 winters ago, something in her heart shifted. Something that wasn't grief. Something that wasn't fear. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the homestead began to change. Vikasa, still quiet and careful, rose early and worked hard. He patched the broken fence along the chicken yard. He cleaned out the rain barrel without being asked. He even climbed to the roof to fix a leak Sarah had ignored for months. When she tried to stop him, worried he might slip, he only shook his head. "I fix," he said. "My way of say thank you." Sarah never asked for thanks, but she accepted. The help. And Luda. Well, the child became the beating heart of the little household. She took her first solid food sitting on Sarah's lap. She took her first unsteady steps between Sarah's boots and Vikasa's bare hands. Every day she grew brighter, stronger, freer. And with every coo and every laugh, the ache in Sarah's chest, the space where a child of her own was supposed to be, began to ease. One quiet afternoon, Sarah sat outside on the porch shelling peas. Vikasa sat nearby, sharpening a dull axe. Luda played in the grass at their feet, crawling after a feather that kept blowing just out of reach. "You good with her," Sarah said after a while, not looking up. Vikasa didn't pause in his work. "She is piece of her mother. I love." Her more each day, Sarah nodded. I can see that. Most men wouldn't have carried a baby all that way. Most would have handed her off or left her behind. Vikasa set the axe down and looked toward the hills in the distance. I make promise, before my wife die, she say, you keep her safe. No matter what. So I walk. Sarah glanced at him. How far? More than 200 mile? No horse, just feet. Hide in woods, sleep in caves. Sarah blinked, stunned. All that? With a baby? Vikasa nodded. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Sarah said quietly, You know, I thought I'd have children one day. We tried, but it never happened. Vikasa turned toward her, sympathy in his eyes. Sarah shrugged. People said it was the Lord's will. That maybe I wasn't meant to be a mother, but when I hold that little girl, I don't know. Feels like the first time I've been needed in a long while. Vikasa's voice was gentle. Maybe Luda need you too. Sarah smiled faintly. Maybe we both needed each other. That night, after Luda was asleep in her basket and the fire had burned low, Sarah stood at the window and watched the moonlight spill across the prairie. She could hear Vikasa moving in the barn, bedding down in the straw as he did every night, never once asking to come inside. She touched the glass with her fingers. She still didn't fully trust him, not because of who he was, but because she wasn't sure how much trust her heart had left to give. But in a world where kindness was rare and judgment was quick, he had proven something again and again, that he was a man who kept promises. And that was more than most. The breaking point came on a Sunday. The church bell rang sharp and loud across Clearwater, drawing every God-fearing family into their pews, dressed in their finest. Sarah hadn't been to service in weeks. Not since the day she took in Vikasa and his baby. She used to sit in the back row, silent and respectful, her hat pulled low and her grief wrapped tightly around her like a shawl. But now? Now folks turned and stared even when she passed the general store. That morning, Sarah stayed home, brushing Luda's soft hair and baking bread with a quiet determination. Vikasa was in the barn, mending a broken harness, pretending not to notice the tension that clung to the air like a gathering storm. By noon, the storm arrived. Hooves pounded the dirt road leading to the cabin. 3 men. All mounted, all carrying rifles slung too visibly for it to be anything but a warning. Vikasa stepped outside first, wiping his hands on a cloth, posture calm but alert. Sarah met him on the porch, Luda held close to her chest. She recognized the man in the middle, Tom Aldridge, one of the wealthier ranchers near the river and a deacon at the church. He didn't dismount. We came to talk, Tom said, voice flat. To settle this before things go too far. Sarah stared at him. What things? You know what? That man's presence has got people riled. There's talk of organizing a committee. Some want to ride him out of town. Some don't care how it's done. You're talking about lynching him, Sarah said, her voice sharper than she meant. Don't hide it behind church words. Tom's jaw twitched. I'm talking about keeping Clearwater safe. He's Lakota. The people here, they've seen raids, they've lost family. You can't expect them to welcome him with open arms. He's not here to raid anyone, she snapped. He's here with a baby. A baby who would have died if I'd listened to folks like you. He could be lying about that child, one of the other men muttered. Might have taken her from someone. Who knows what they do out there? Vikasa stood quietly behind her. Saying nothing, his hand still. Sarah looked at each of the men in turn. You think a man walks 200 miles on foot, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a sick baby in his arms, because he stole her? You think he sleeps in a barn while I nurse her back to health because he's planning something evil? The baby stirred, cooing against Sarah's shoulder. Look at her, Sarah said, stepping forward. You're talking about a child. A child who smiles when she sees him, who cries when he leaves the room. You want to burn down my house because she was born with brown skin? Tom shifted in the saddle, uncomfortable. It ain't personal, Sarah, but folks are afraid. I've been afraid too, she said. Afraid of waking up every morning with nothing left to care about. Afraid of living in a world where people would rather watch a baby freeze than share their fire. She paused, her voice steadying. But I'm not afraid of him. The silence that followed stretched long and taut. Then, slowly, Tom leaned forward in his saddle. I suggest you think about what kind of future you're inviting, for yourself and for that child. I have, Sarah replied. And I've decided I'd rather raise her to be kind and brave and different than to raise her to be like you. Tom's face hardened. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode off. The others followed. Sarah stood there until the dust from their hooves had fully settled. Then she looked at Vikasa. I won't lie to you, she said. They're not going to stop. They're just getting started. I leave, he said again. I take her. You be safe. No. She shook her head. You leave now, and they win. You leave now, and they think they were right. That you were dangerous. That I was foolish. I not want you hurt. I've already been hurt, she whispered, and I survived? What I won't survive is looking back years from now knowing I let fear decide what kind of woman I was. Vikasa looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. They didn't speak again that evening. But that night, when Sarah opened the back door to bring in the laundry, she found Vikasa sitting on the porch, Luda in his lap, pointing up at the stars. He looked up at Sarah and said, softly, she not scared. Sarah sat beside them and whispered, neither am I. The first frost came early. One morning, Sarah stepped outside to find a delicate shimmer of ice crusting the pumpkins and cabbages in the garden. The breath in her lungs turned white. She rubbed her hands together, the chill biting through her. Shawl. Winter was coming, and with it, a sense that something was about to change. Inside the cabin, Vikasa sat by the fire, rocking Luda in his arms. He'd been quieter than usual these last few days. Not that he'd ever been talkative, but now his silences carried weight, like he was guarding something heavier than mere words. Sarah poured water into the kettle and finally asked, "What is it you're not telling me?" Vikasa looked up, startled. "You've been looking over your shoulder every hour, watching the road like something might come out of it. Are you running from more than just gossip, Vikasa?" He shifted Luda to his other arm, eyes fixed on the flames. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he began. "I was scout," he said, "for Army, blue coats." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You worked for the U.S. Army?" He nodded. "Long ago. Before war ended. They offer land, food, promise safety. I help them cross land, help find camps. I believe they want peace." Sarah sat slowly at the table. "And?" His face grew dark. "One day, they say, follow trail to Lakota camp. Small. No weapons. Old men, women, children." Her stomach turned. She already knew where this was going. "They go at night," Vikasa continued. "Kill them all. Burn everything. Even after I say no danger. No warriors there. Just people." He paused, jaw clenched. "I tried to stop. They say I traitor. I run." Sarah was silent. The fire crackled. "I walk away from Army," he said. "But Lakota say I traitor too. I lead Army to people. I carry shame of both." His voice broke just slightly. "So I walk alone until I find her my wife. She didn't care what others say. She say, 'You live like a tree that was burned but still gives shade.'" He smiled faintly at the memory. "She loved me, gave me this daughter, and then she died." Sarah's throat tightened. "You've carried that story all this way, haven't you?" He nodded. "And no one's heard it but me?" No one stay long enough to ask. She rose from the table, crossed the room, and stood beside him. For the first time since he'd arrived, she reached out and touched his shoulder, not out of politeness, not out of necessity, but with quiet respect. You did what you thought was right. You tried to help. That makes you better than most, she said. He shook his head. I failed. No, she replied softly. You were betrayed. That's not the same thing. Luda stirred in his arms and looked up at Sarah, blinking sleepily. She reached for her, and Vikasa gently handed the child over. She's the only thing I've got left, he said. Not anymore, Sarah whispered, holding Luda close. You've got more than you think. Later that evening, Sarah found herself standing alone on the porch, watching the wind move through the prairie grass. Vikasa was in the barn again, and Luda was asleep in the cradle by the fire. The sky was streaked with the last remnants of sunset orange bleeding into purple. Purple fading into deep black dots, she thought about everything he had said. The betrayal, the loss, the loneliness that must have haunted every mile of his journey. And she thought about the way he had stayed, not just in body, but in spirit. How he worked without complaint. How he loved that little girl with a fierce, unshakable devotion. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't asked for a man with a complicated past or a baby with Lakota blood. But now, she couldn't imagine her home without them. That night, she added an extra log to the fire and unlocked the back door. Before heading to bed, she didn't say a word to Vikasa about it, but when she woke just before dawn and stepped into the parlor to check on Luda, she noticed the barn door hadn't latched that night, and the inside door was pulled softly closed. She smiled. He'd come in from the cold, and she had let him. The sky was gunmetal gray the morning. It happened. The air was too still. No birds sang. No wind moved the trees. Even the animals seemed to sense something waiting in the silence. Sarah was outside, hanging a damp sheet when she noticed the dust rising from the road, a slow, deliberate cloud. Her hands froze on the clothesline. She squinted. 6 riders. Not townsfolk just passing through. This was something organized. Intentional. Wicasa stepped onto the porch behind her, Luda in his arms. They come again, he said. Sarah turned to him, face grim. Get her inside. He didn't argue. She followed them into the cabin, bolted the door behind them, and pulled the rifle down from above the hearth. It was her late husband, still clean, still sharp. She checked the rounds with practiced fingers. Vikasa rocked Luda, quieting her as the horses drew closer. Sarah moved to the front window just as the riders reached the gate. They didn't dismount. 5 men she recognized, 1 she didn't. All armed. Tom Aldridge was among them. His mouth was tight, eyes harder than before. Sarah, he shouted. We're done talking. Sarah opened the window just enough to make herself heard. So now what? You come to scare me into doing what's convenient for you? Tom's voice was cold. We come to do what the sheriff wants. That man is a threat, and if you're too blind to see it, then we'll deal with it ourselves. You think that baby's a threat too? She snapped out. Another man rode forward. No one's laying a hand on that child, but that man? He's poison, and you're letting him fester right here at our back door. Behind her, Vikasa gently placed Luda in the cradle. His face was calm, but his hands were clenched. He stepped forward and said quietly, I go, alone. They not harm her. Sarah turned to him, fire in her eyes. No. I not let you be hurt for me. And I won't let you be hunted like an animal for daring to survive. She looked at the window again, then unbolted the door. Vikasa grabbed her arm, alarmed, but she pulled free. Sarah stepped onto the porch slowly, the rifle resting across. Her arms barrel low but visible. I'm not a fool, she called. I know what this is. This isn't about law or safety. This is about fear, about hatred. about small men trying to feel big by going after someone who can't fight back. Tom sat straighter in his saddle. You're making a mistake. No. Sarah said, You are. She lifted the rifle, not at them, but skyward, and fired a single shot. The crack echoed like thunder across the land. For a second, the riders flinched, hands going to weapons. Sarah's voice didn't waver. That was a warning. The next one won't be. You step onto my land again with weapons drawn, you'd better be ready to finish what you start. Tom opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another voice rang out behind them. That baby's got more right to be here than the rest of you, judging by her smile. The riders turned. Mrs. Hattie Mayfield, the preacher's wife, stood near the tree line, hands on her hips, her Sunday shawl trailing in the wind. A few more people stood behind her. Mr. Shelby, the wheelwright, Eli, the stable boy, even old Doc Branner leaning on his cane. We heard that shot, Hattie said, and we came to see if this woman needed help. Tom's jaw worked. This doesn't concern you. Hattie took a step forward. Anything that threatens a baby concerns me. And a town that lets a mob ride out to a widow's land? That concerns me more. The standoff stretched thin as wire. Then, one by one, the riders turned their horses, some out of shame, some out of frustration. But they turned. Tom was the last to go, spitting in the dirt before galloping away. Sarah lowered her rifle and exhaled. Slowly, behind her, Vicasa stepped outside, holding Luda once more. She looked between the baby and the horizon. We didn't win anything permanent, she said. No, Vicasa agreed. But maybe we show something, Sarah nodded, that we're not alone anymore. He looked down at Luda. She'll remember. This land, the fire, the courage. And the woman who fought for her like she was her own, Sarah added. He looked at Sarah then. For a long, quiet moment, they said nothing. But something passed between them that needed no words. Snow came early that year, soft at first, then heavier, blanketing the prairie like silence come to life. The wind lost its dry edge and turned sharp, bitter. The fields fell quiet, and the world seemed to retreat into itself. Inside Sarah Blake's cabin, the fire rarely went out. It had been 3 weeks since the riders came. Since Sarah stood on her porch, rifle in hand, and made it clear she would rather be exiled than bend. The townsfolk hadn't spoken much to her since. A few, like Hattie Mayfield, came by with canned peaches or quilt scraps. Others crossed the street to avoid her, but Sarah didn't mind. Her home was full. Vicasa was still there, no longer sleeping. In the barn, he'd moved in quietly, humbly, without a word. She had simply left the back door unlatched each night and cleared space in the cabin. One morning she found his coat hanging on the wall hook beside hers. Another, his tools lined neatly on her porch bench. He hadn't asked permission, and she hadn't needed to give it. Now he chopped firewood without being asked. He stirred soup, wrapped Luda in blankets, and fixed the squeaky hinge on the cellar door. He belonged here, not in some loud or claiming way, but like a river knows how to run through stone without breaking it. One evening, as snow ticked softly against the windows, Sarah stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. Behind her, Vicasa sat near the hearth, Luda on his knee, singing softly in Lakota. Sarah turned and leaned against the table, listening. I don't know what you're saying, she said after a moment, but she sure likes it. He smiled without looking up. It is lullaby. My mother sang to me, long ago. Sarah walked over and knelt beside them. Can you teach it to me? Vicasa hesitated, then nodded. Yes, easy words, soft meaning. He sang a line again, slowly, and Sarah repeated it, stumbling at first. Then more clearly. Luda clapped her little hands in approval, and they all laughed. Sarah looked into Vicasa's eyes, realizing how far they had come. Not just in miles, in trust, in understanding. "You're not leaving, are you?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice steadier than any she'd heard from him, he said, "No. If you let me stay, I stay." She held his gaze. "I want you to." The next morning, Sarah went into town for the first time in over a week. She had business to tend flour, cloth, more candles. The snow was already thick, and she knew travel would soon become near impossible. She wrapped Luda in wool and carried her against her chest. Vikasa stayed behind to split wood. People stared. They always did. But this time, it was different. When she entered the store, Mr. Kellen behind the counter gave her a polite nod, nothing warm, but not hostile. A couple of women turned their backs as she passed, but Hattie gave her a wink and a soft hello. Then came the surprise. Behind the store, posted on the town board, was a flyer. A government notice. Sarah paused, eyes narrowing. It read, "Reward for Lakota fugitive name unknown. Accused of betrayal of U.S. military operation and aiding hostiles. Accompanied by child likely stolen. Armed. Considered dangerous. Sarah's." Blood ran cold. It wasn't signed. It didn't have a date. But it was him. She tore it down without a word and folded it into her coat. She didn't tell anyone what she saw. Not that night. Not the next. But when she returned home, she sat beside Vikasa after supper and quietly slid the paper into his hands. He read it slowly. His jaw tightened, but his eyes remained steady. "I thought this might come," he said. "They won't take her," Sarah said. "They might take me." "No," she said, "not without going through me." Vikasa looked at her, startled, but only for a moment. Then something softened in his face. "I stay," he said again, "not just for her. For you too." And this time she didn't answer. With words. She simply reached out, placed her hand on his, and didn't let go. The snow didn't let up for days. Wind howled around the cabin like it was mourning something ancient. The windows frosted over. The roads disappeared under drifts. Clearwater all but closed itself off from the world, every soul tucked away, waiting for spring. But inside Sarah's home, life kept going. Vikasa carved small animals for Luda, smoothing each shape by firelight. Sarah baked bread that filled the cabin with warmth. They worked in rhythm, without needing to speak. Some days passed in silence, but not in loneliness. There was comfort now. A quiet trust that grew like roots under the snow. Yet the paper, the bounty notice, sat folded in a drawer, unspoken, but never forgotten. One night, as the fire cracked low and Luda slept curled in her little basket, Sarah finally asked what had been pressing on her heart. "If they come again," she said softly, "if soldiers or bounty men show up at my door, what do we do?" Vikasa stared at the fire for a long time. His voice was even when he finally answered, "We don't run." Sarah tilted her head. "You mean fight?" He shook his head. "I mean, we live in the open, not hiding like ghosts. If they take me, they take me knowing I had a home. A woman who stood beside me. A daughter who knew I loved her." Sarah swallowed hard. "You still believe you're running?" she asked. He turned toward her. "No, not anymore. I stopped running when you opened that door." She looked at him, really. Looked at him, the scar along his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the pain he carried, and the courage that refused to fade. "I'm tired of pretending I'm not part of something," she said. "You're not just some guest. You're here. And I want you to stay." Vikasa said nothing, but he reached across the table and took her hand, slowly, deliberately. It was not a proposal. It was something deeper. Spring crept in like a secret, subtle but certain. The frost melted. The soil softened. Luda took her first full steps across. The thawing earth, arms out, wobbling like a calf but squealing with joy. Sarah and Vikasa both laughed and clapped for her. It was a sound so full it scared away the last pieces of sorrow still hanging in Sarah's bones. The bounty never came, or maybe it did, and someone along the way decided not to turn in a man who sang lullabies to a little girl and chopped wood. For a widow without asking for anything in return. The flyer in the drawer yellowed. Sarah never looked at it again by the time summer rolled in. The town's silence had changed. They didn't welcome the family outright, but they stopped sneering. The chickens still clucked in Sarah's yard. Her eggs still sold at market. A few neighbors even began to speak to her again, nodding as she passed, pretending they hadn't once tried to drive her out when Hattie Mayfield came by with fresh sugar and a bundle of cloth. She caught a glimpse of Vikasa sanding a cradle. By the barn, her brows rose slightly. "You fixing up for another?" she asked with a sly grin. Sarah smiled. "Not yet. But I think she'll have a sibling soon enough." "Well," Hattie said, setting down the cloth, "Clearwater may be slow to understand, but it ain't slow to notice who's willing to stand firm." Sarah nodded. "I didn't know what to call this before. What we were, what we had." Hattie looked at her kindly. "It's called a family, dear. Don't let anyone tell you different." That evening, Sarah sat with Vikasa on the porch. Luda was asleep in Sarah's arms, fingers curled in her apron. "You gave her life," Sarah whispered. Vikasa shook his head. "You gave her hope." They sat quietly, the stars blinking above them. Finally, Vikasa asked the question she'd been waiting for, if people ask. "What do we say we are?" Sarah turned to him, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She smiled. "We say we're hers. That's all they need to know." Vikasa reached out, placed a hand on Luda's back, then covered Sarah's hand. With his own dot and under the stars, on a porch weathered by time and wind and love, three people once lost, once hunted, once broken, became something whole.